This month, we've been reflecting on the long history of queer Catholics.
And today, we're closing it out with someone who's been shaping that history for decades, Marianne Duddy-Burke of DignityUSA.
Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
An embrace of fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
Welcome back to Whiplash. As we wrap up LGBTQ plus History Month, Emma and I have been reflecting on what it means to be part of a story that's so much bigger than any one person or even any one podcast series.
Absolutely. The conversations we've shared this month were never meant to be a complete history of LGBTQ plus Catholics. They're just a glimpse, a slice of the many experiences, struggles, and joys that make up our collective story.
There are so many others doing this work too. Emma is one of them, running the Queer and Catholic Oral History Project, where she's documented the experiences of people like Sister Janine Gramick and Jason Jack, who have been instrumental in LGBTQ plus Catholic ministry. US-based groups like New Ways Ministry, spearheaded by Sister Janine, whose decades of ministry have been foundational for so many, and of course, there's Outreach, founded by Father James Martin and supported by Pope Francis himself, and now Pope Leo. Outreach has become a community space for queer Catholics around the world, and actually it's how Emma and I first met.
Yes, but New Ways Ministry and Outreach are not alone. Groups like the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, La Tenda de Giornata, Sembrado Unidad en la Diversidad, and more fight for inclusion and acceptance in Catholic communities around the world. The importance of these spaces for support and connection can't be overstated. This work, pushing for the respect and dignity of queer people in the Church, is essential. It's often slow, sometimes unglamorous, but always deeply important.
To close out this month, we're honored to share a conversation that Emma had with Marianne Duddy-Burke, the Executive Director of DignityUSA, an organization that's been at the heart of this work for more than 50 years, and one that I am now a board member of as well.
Yes! Marianne joined me to talk about the evolution of dignity, the ongoing struggle for inclusion, and what hope looks like for queer Catholics today.
Let's get into it.
So thank you so much, Marianne. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me and share more about the history of DignityUSA. Before we get started, I always like to ask people, would you mind sharing a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved in Dignity?
Well, thank you for having me. It's exciting to be part of this project. I have been involved with Dignity since the fall of 1982. I was 21 years old, shortly out of college, and I was a student at what was then the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, very early into my first year there. And I had an experience in college in which I was president of the Newman group. I went to a non-Catholic college, so they have a community called the Newman Center, which is the ministry to Catholic students. And my sophomore year, I was president of the Newman group, and the priest chaplain had somehow, to this day I don't know how, heard that I was a lesbian. And he called me to his office and confronted me about it and asked, is this true? And it was the first time that I had ever been confronted about my sexual orientation. I had always come out by choice up till that point and was still fairly new at it. I was out, less than a year at that point. I took a deep breath and I said, yes, I am. And he said, we can't have someone like you representing Catholics on campus. I will accept your resignation.
Oh, my goodness.
And I was stunned. And I called the woman who was serving as vice president and said, that the priest had asked me to resign, and apparently she was now in charge, and kind of left it at that. And at that point, I sort of lost my Catholic community, which had been really important to me all my life. I didn't feel ashamed or doubt my connection with God. And I knew deep inside somehow that this priest was really wrong in what he had done to me. But I went for several years at that point without having a Catholic community. Occasionally I'd make it to a mass down in the town or somewhere else. And I had lots of groups within the chaplaincy department that I could connect with, but I was missing that part.
Yeah.
And in the Boston Sunday Globe, my straight roommate after college found an article about Dignity Boston in a Sunday paper. And it talked about this. At that point, it was called a gay and lesbian Catholic community. And said, this sounds perfect for you. And we went that very night. She went with me. I was terrified. We sat in Dignity Boston was at that point meeting at the Arlington Street Church in the basement in the parish hall. And so we went and sat in a corner of the Boston Common or the public gardens and watched people go in, and eventually decided that there were enough people and they looked kind of normal and it would be safe. And we went down the stairs and snuck into a back row. And as soon as the mass started and I heard all these voices singing, I felt home. And so this has been my Catholic community, my faith community for my entire adult life. It's where I was married. It's where our kids were baptized. It's the group that was with me through the deaths of my parents and my sister. It's been an amazing journey.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing. And I know you mentioned that Dignity existed at that point. What did the early days of the organization look like? When did it get started?
Dignity is the oldest Catholic LGBTQ organization in the entire world. And
Whoa.
and Dignity, along with MCC, are the two oldest national queer groups in the United States. We were founded in February of 1969. So we're actually a pre-Stonewall organization. And we were started as the ministry of an Augustinian priest out in San Diego. A fact we reminded Pope Leo of in our congratulatory letter to him, that our ministry was started by one of his brother priests. So this priest, whose name was Father Patrick Nydorf, went to his community because he was very troubled by the kinds of what he called overwhelming guilt heard from gay people in confession, and said, this isn't right. We need to do something for these people. And his community affirmed this as a call to ministry. And he started gathering gay men, lesbians, and some straight supporters for Bible study and mass and conversation in private homes in San Diego. 1969, it was still illegal to be gay. It was considered a psychological or psychiatric illness and very much a sin. So he was very, very careful in those days. He did a personal interview with everyone who wanted to be part of the group to make sure they weren't folks who were going to be preying on folks or causing danger for them, that they really were sincere. And the group just kept spreading and spreading, and people from Los Angeles asked him to come. And, so he was going back and forth between San Diego and Los Angeles. And then he got in trouble with the archbishop or an interim bishop in Los Angeles, who was annoyed that this order priest was conducting a ministry in his diocese without his permission. And he was ordered to step down. And at that point, the Dignity group in Los Angeles came together and decided to continue it as a lay ministry, which it always has been since 1971. We've had lay leadership. There have certainly been priests and religious women and ministers from other denominations who have partnered with Dignity, but the group has been run by lay people. It was very much a Vatican II kind of spirit that infused our organization. And in the early 70s, there was a little ad in a Los Angeles queer paper that was seen by folks traveling to LA from across the country and even in other countries. And people would write to this P.O. box and said, I'd like to have Dignity where I live. And so these folks the volunteers from LA and San Diego would write or make phone calls. There was no email, no anything there. It was all done by U.S. mail or by long distance phone calls to help people get started in communities all around the country. And at that point, Dignity was often the first gay organization in a city other than the bars. And again, it was this climate where, people didn't use their last names. They made up names. Our activities were often raided by the police. And, it was a very dangerous organization in some ways for people to be part of.
Yes. Yes. And I know you mentioned that it is specifically a lay ministry. It has been since the very beginning. How do you think that's affected the organization, its success? Why is it an important part of the work that you do and how you do it?
Yeah, I think that we have created we live a new model of church that is tough for some people to understand. And I probably shouldn't have said we created it, because there are other groups. There are women church groups. There are other intentional Eucharistic communities out there that follow a very similar model. But, for our church to be run for our faith communities to be run by lay people who run the liturgy committees, who manage the finances, who govern the organization, who decide who's going to preside at liturgies, is a really different model in Catholicism, and it impacts so much of what we do. We allow every community to make decisions about its liturgical practice based on their own local needs and their local resources. There are some places where diocesan priests or order priests who are still in officially recognized ministry will minister with dignity, often in stealth, because most bishops in the country have forbidden priests from doing that. And there are places where there hasn't been an ordained priest presiding for decades at this point. So lay people preside for the liturgies, women priests preside, married priests preside, sometimes folks from other denominations will help out. When the last version of the missals and, the order of service was developed, there was a lot of controversy about whether it was done in a just way and about some of the language, which was very exclusionary and very old-fashioned, whether that was really helpful to the way we prayed. So most of our communities got together and had a series of meetings around, should we use this new version of the Mass? Or is it so problematic that we can't, in good conscience, do it? Some communities decided to use it. Some decided to stick with the old version of the Mass, and some kind of adapted components so that we, prayed in language and in ways and in levels of participation that were comfortable for that community. So there's a lot of empowerment of all of the people of the church. Somebody can't just come in and say, "Hi, I'm a priest. I'm going to be in charge now." That's just not how it works. So, we have this sort of fiercely independent streak within us, so that we really can be as affirming and welcoming and inclusive as we need to be for our community. That makes us pretty unique among LGBTQ Catholic ministries. We were officially banned from Catholic spaces in 1986, but even before that, this was happening. And, yes, it's been very painful to know that we're not welcome in the buildings and in the retreat centers and the colleges that mean so much to so many of us. But there's also a tremendous amount of liberation in not owing anything to the institutional church structure. We choose how we interact with the institutional church.
100%, 100%. So well said. And I really appreciate Dignity because it's definitely been a group on the front lines of inclusion in terms of pushing for more liberation theology. You say specifically thinking critically about what language is used. Could you share a little bit more about how liberation theology and embracing and exploring liberation theology has been part of the history of Dignity?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the very significant figures in our early history was Father John McNeill, who was a Jesuit, whose kind of groundbreaking book is The Homosexual, My Neighbor, right? And he went on to publish a whole series of books, but some of his early articles were discovered by these gay and lesbian people and bisexual people who were meeting under the auspices of Dignity back in the late 60s, early 70s. And they wrote to him and asked, could we publish some of your works? I think it'd be really helpful to our community. And he got to know the community and agreed. So having theology in the liberationist tradition and sort of at the birth of queer theology within the Catholic movement influenced how we thought about ourselves and how we treated each other and what our relationship to authority has been really influential since then, and kind of continuing to support the emergence of theology that is born out of our own experience, our experience of being on the margins and our experience of embracing parts of ourselves that we are told are less than ideal or even sinful, has been a real tradition for us and a proud moment. And one of my proudest moments was in 2019 at DignityUSA's 50th anniversary conference. We held a joint meeting with the global network of Rainbow Catholics. They had their conference first in Chicago. We did a day of overlap, and then the Dignity USA conference began. And in that overlap day, we brought 3 out queer Catholic theologians onto a stage for session, for each of them presenting papers for the first time ever in history. It was a phenomenal moment, and they were so generous. They made their papers available to the global network of Rainbow Catholics to be translated at no cost into whatever languages were needed. So, we feel like we've done a lot to help get these Catholic movements and the theology that underpins them out across the world. That was published in Chinese and Portuguese and German and Swahili. And, I don't even remember all the languages that this material was made available in, but that's been a really significant part of what we've done. We've helped, communities in other countries find their own voices as well.
Most definitely. Most definitely. And I really appreciate Dignity being one of the few, if not the only, LGBTQ plus Catholic organization that also partners with interfaith initiatives, but also Roman Catholic women priests and women who are seeking ordination and leadership within the church. Why do you think that that is important for the future of LGBTQ plus Catholicism, but also interfaith queer advocacy?
Yeah. Our theology and our faith is really rooted in the fact that everyone is a person created and called into being by God, and that every human life reveals an aspect of the divine that otherwise would not be known to the world. And there's no way to exclude anybody from that. So, the fact that women are still excluded from any kind of ordained ministry within the institutional church is an injustice, in the same way that discrimination against LGBTQ people is an injustice in the church. And, I think, and the separation of communions and the divisions in the body of Christ is an injustice in the church. Our oppression is connected to every other oppression. And we take pretty seriously our need to be engaged beyond the liturgy, that our faith has to be present in the world, that we have to show up as all of who we are in various spaces, whether it's No King's marches or, immigration support centers or food pantries or Black Lives Matter marches, or, with helping to support women who are called to ordination, or to people who are challenging the whole issue of ordination as power, and really looking at sort of the servanthood of ministry is really important to us.
100%. 100%. And I'm really curious, as a historian myself, I love delving into the history. I was so excited for our conversation today. I had a couple moments in history that I know are really pivotal for the LGBTQ plus community. And I'm really curious if you can share a little bit more about how Dignity USA was involved, responding to these moments, reaching out to the community, holding space for diverse experiences and solidarity. I'm specifically interested, beginning with the HIV and AIDS crisis for Dignity. What did ministry to the community look like at this time?
It's hard to talk about that, particularly in these days where we're seeing so many very similar kinds of echoes about the ways in which people are marginalized and how healthcare is being denied to so many, whether it's trans folks or poor people or whatever. There are a lot of echoes of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And certainly because Dignity's model at that point had meant that we were rooted in large cities that gay people tended to flock to, and particularly gay men were flocking to. And because at that time we were a predominantly male organization, HIV and AIDS hit us really hard. And our community was very much on the front lines of everything from helping to organize care networks, starting with our own members, but spreading beyond that. We were very much involved with groups like ACT UP and other AIDS advocacy organizations in terms of trying to call all of our institutions, political, medical, religious, to account for the shameful way in which they were ignoring or even demonizing people with HIV and AIDS. We were there for a lot of members whose parents were finding out that their child was gay and was dying at the same time. And then being present with the families as they grieved this loss of a son, usually, that they didn't really know entirely, and who often just died without a level of dignity being recognized by the institutions that they should have been able to trust. We were there doing the funerals for people when the churches or funeral parlors refused to handle their bodies or their services. We were there for the gay priests who died of AIDS, or making sure they had support and services. We were a co-founder of the National Catholic AIDS Network. Involved in interfaith work at that point. It was, and we had almost entire chapters wiped out in some places from the community, and it was really devastating times. I mean, there were times in my own life, 3 Sundays or 3 Saturdays in a row, I'd be at a funeral, and then at the Dignity Mass the next day, and then, helping to sort through possessions or clean things up. I mean, that's what our lives were like, right? It was grieve in the morning, protest in the afternoon, dance at night, was sort of our motto in those days. And it does feel very similar in some ways to today. So I'm hoping that some of those lessons are being reclaimed, and people are telling the stories of what that time was like. And I hope it doesn't get that bad, but I don't trust that it won't get that bad.
Yes, I hear you as saying that. I think right now, especially for queer and trans members of the community, especially queer and trans people of color, the level of violence and outright murder that's occurring on a massive scale in the United States is terrifying.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it is really shameful to me to know that, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is in some ways very much leading the charge against prevention of access to health care for our trans and non-binary people, and is standing back and doing nothing about the violence that is being inflicted on members of our community and members of the body of Christ.
Most definitely. And I'm curious for you, specifically into the 1990s and the early 2000s, during a period when many other communities of faith, specifically non-Catholic, were kind of coming into their own of open and affirming during this time, and focused more on what queer outreach and ministry looked like. What did the history of Dignity appear, especially during a time with more conservative popes before we got Francis? What did that look like for Dignity?
Yeah, there were so many strands that were just diverging at that point, right? As you said, many Christian denominations were wrestling openly with acceptance of LGBTQ, mostly LGB, but over time the T and the Qs coming into it, members of their congregation, the question of ordination, the question of commitment ceremonies at that point, all being discussed, and Catholicism having two very conservative and very dogmatic popes in a row, in John Paul II and then Benedict XVI, where any dissent was really squashed, and where I feel like queer theology was bubbling around in people's minds and in the underground, but there just wasn't a space for it in Catholic academia, and anyone who tried to put forth controversial ideas couldn't get published, could get censured, could have, the wrath of the institutional church brought upon them. At the same time we were dealing with, the height of the AIDS crisis, there was this 1986 document, we call it the Halloween letter, but officially it was the letter on the pastoral care of homosexual persons, published right around Halloween in 1986, that blamed AIDS on our own behavior. It said that we should not be surprised when we agitate for civil rights, for a lifestyle no one should have any entitlement to, and that violence occurs, kind of justifying anti-gay violence, and ordering bishops across the world, but really it pertained to the U.S. and it pertained to Dignity, to kick our group out of Catholic spaces. Early in our movement, we actually found a lot of support among church officials and church institutions, and there was a real strand of Catholic progressivism and human rights protections and, all that Vatican II spirit. But by the early 80s, it was clear there was a war between sort of the conservatives and the progressives, for use of political terms, and that the conservative dogma won out. And, chapter after chapter was expelled from Catholic space during that time. So, as there was this growing liberalism and awareness and or discussion of LGBTQ issues in many strands of Christianity, it was becoming more suppressed in Catholicism officially. But what was also interesting is that the people of the church, I think, really responded to the devastating tragedy of the AIDS crisis by coming to understand that suppressing word of homosexuality and alienating queer kids and all of that was not consistent with the message of love. And we started seeing these incredible polls among Catholics that started showing Catholics being more supportive of gay people than any other denomination. And it was kind of mind-blowing because, the Catholic Church was seen as monolithically oppressive to LGBTQ people. But the reality is there was this huge chasm between the church leadership and the people of the church. And more LGBTQ Catholics were coming out and talking to their families, and people were learning from the tragedy of AIDS that exclusion was not right. And, there was much more embrace, and it was gradual for sure, but it was very, very much a trend that I think was not noticed by enough people until much later. So a very confusing and conflicted kind of time.
Most definitely. Most definitely. And thinking through to the election of Pope Francis, for the first time, LGBTQ plus Catholics and Catholics as a whole, hearing the Pope say, "Who am I to judge?" but also a complicated legacy, including using slurs at the same time and releasing documents like Dignitas Infinita that openly denied the existence of queer, trans, non-binary, intersex Catholics. What did that look like for Dignity?
Yeah, it was a complicated time. And, Pope Francis did not come into the papacy with a great record on LGBTQ issues. I mean, he was opposing the common law trends to recognize same-sex relationships in Argentina, and he was very much a campaigner against gender ideology, a phrase we heard, throughout his papacy. But I think he was someone with a pastoral heart and with humility. And he was someone who openly invited discussion about controversial topics and did not emphasize adherence to dogma in the same way his two predecessors had. And I think that allowed a lot of new things to start flourishing there. There was this birth of Catholic queer theology coming out into the open during his papacy. Theologians were not being censured. Pastoral ministers who started LGBTQ ministries were allowed to kind of keep doing that, and even got some support in some quarters and some dioceses. So we started seeing this real kind of change of tone. And then as Francis's papacy went on, there were more of these indications that maybe the dogma was not the whole story, right? There still has not been any change in the dehumanizing teachings and in official approval, but, things like having blessings for same-sex couples, even if they can't be liturgical and, have to look spontaneous and can't look anything like a marriage, and open meetings with LGBTQ Catholics and even organizational leaders. Meeting of the Pope with the executive director of DignityUSA. I mean, mind-blowing things that would never have happened before that time. I think he did a lot to put LGBTQ people and issues on the main stage, right? In Catholicism. We don't need to be in the shadows, and we're never going back into the shadows anymore. And I think that, having us living in the light is a very important shift in Catholic realities that we need to keep pressing forward on.
100%. And thinking through to what Dignity is looking forward to in their development in the future. I know we have a new Pope now, an American. I know we very truly know very little about Pope Leo and his first actions as a Pope. And in consequence, his track record reads much like Francis, with some particularly negative things in the past, but they're over a decade old.
And they were under the Benedict papacy, where, conformity was really important.
100%. What do you all envision for the future, for Dignity, of remaining in the light and standing on your ground, in your truth?
Yeah. Well, a few things. One, we are very encouraged that Pope Leo has committed to continuing the synodal process, and that, before his death, Pope Francis extended the synodal process for another 3 years. It was supposed to end this month, actually, in June of 2025. But it's now been extended through 2028 with, timelines about how do we implement all of these things that we've discussed and heard as a church. So we are continuing to press for openly LGBTQ representation in the official synod meetings, however they look forward to. That is not a goal that was achieved under Pope Francis, but we have rekindled that campaign and are going to keep pressing for it. There is actually an LGBTQ specific event as part of the Holy Year that the church is celebrating on September 6th of this year. There is a Vatican-approved LGBTQ pilgrimage into St. Peter's Square. We're going to have a delegation from Dignity joining with the delegation from the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, to be part of this presence that says to the church, yep, we're here. We're going to participate in this Holy Year as we participate in every church activities. We are part of the church. We have gifts that we can offer to the church, and we have things that need to be changed to make us full members of the church. For us, we talk about we want justice, equality, and full inclusion of LGBTQ people in our church and in our world. And that means sacramental equality in the church. Every one of the church's sacraments should be offered to people no matter what their gender identity, sexual orientation, relationship or marital status is. That means ordination, that means marriage, that means baptism, that means all of it. We are still pointing out to the church the ways in which pastoral care is denied. The growing number of dioceses that refuse to bury people who are in same-sex marriages in Catholic cemeteries. I mean, tragic amounts of pain at a time when many people, many families need the church at a high degree. We're raising all of these things up, pressing the church officials to understand how banning gender-affirming care for transgender non-binary individuals, particularly young people, is harmful and does not allow people to live the abundant life that Jesus calls us to. All of these messages continue for us, whether Pope Leo's in the chair or somebody else.
And what do you see as the importance of LGBTQ plus affirming specifically Catholic organizations like yours in both the fight for queer liberation, but also people knowing that queer people of faith exist and have community?
Yeah, I think we serve two very important purposes. One, I think by providing affirming spaces, we allow people to deal with the religious trauma that so many members of the LGBTQ community, so many people who are loved ones of, particularly among young people, friends are traumatized, family members are traumatized by exclusionary tactics. And we want them to understand that there are role models for how to get past that. There are people who are out and proud as both queer and Catholic and who claim their faith and who are fighting to be able to be whole in religious spaces and who are doing the work to try and minimize and eventually eradicate that possibility of religious trauma for future generations. Secondly, I think that we have to stand within the LGBTQ community, where there are so many people who feel alienated justly by religious institutions and by the harm that is done, to show them that there are people of faith within our community and there needs to be a space for us, and that it's a fundamental human right to be able to practice your faith as you choose. And we should not have to decide as queer people that any part of ourselves needs to be left at the door. So witnessing within our own community is just as important. Witnessing within our own community is important, whether that community is Catholic or whether that community is queer.
100%, incredibly well said. And I'm curious, as you've mentioned, thinking through to your own personal experience. I know that you mentioned these communities have been spaces where you got married, where you baptized your children. What has it meant to you as an LGBTQ plus Catholic to have an organization like this to lead and to be involved in?
Recently I've been thinking a lot about my dreams as a young Catholic girl. And I wanted to have the Virgin Mary appear to me, which she hasn't done yet. But I wanted to be a priest and I wanted to be a mom. And somehow it didn't occur to, 6-year-old me that wasn't going to happen for a girl. But I'm kind of living a life in which I'm a full-time professional minister. I'm married. I'm a parent. I have this incredible network of friends and supporters. I get to, hear people's stories from all across the country and even all around the world and touch lives. So Dignity has made me a whole person. And, my favorite verse in the Bible is, "For with God, all things are possible." And I feel like being part of the Dignity community and having people who nurtured this timid little 21-year-old into somebody who is able to represent our whole community on a global stage and in a global church, and to help others to do that is a journey I could never have envisioned. This organization has created possibilities for so many people that we didn't think could ever exist. I feel like so many of us live miracles every single day. There's not a whole lot that's better than that.
And I always like to ask, sometimes they're the simple moments and sometimes they're big ones. What are some, maybe one or two experiences that stand out to you most at a Dignity event at a Dignity organizational conference, at a service that you attended that really meant a great deal to you, maybe reflected the legacy and impact of your organization?
I think back to my wedding day. Becky and I were married on September 6, 1998, and we sent invitations out to our family, our friends, to Becky's former religious community, to, work colleagues, to everybody, saying that we were going to celebrate the sacred covenant of marriage at this Mass. And, the church was packed, family was there, friends from grammar school up through our current work situations, members of Becky's religious order showed up. The Dignity community from around the country was there. And after we said our vows, when it came time for communion, we served as the Eucharistic ministers. We were the ones who fed everybody. And that has stood for me as such a moment of what we wanted our relationship to be and what we believe that any loving relationship is. It is a source of sustenance to the world and to our communities. And that's as true for a same-sex couple, for a couple where one or more people are transgender, where it's a straight couple, where it's a bi couple of any configuration, whatever that relationship is. If you are living in love and supporting each other and reaching out to live your values, you're a blessing to the community. And I mean, that's for me is the purest moment of being able to live a sacramental life that has impact beyond the moment.
Yes. And with other members of your organization, specifically members that joined at the same time you did, members of my generation who have come to this organization and found home and safety, what are some particularly or possibly one or two impactful moments or experiences of seeing the meaning and importance of the work you do in the lives of others?
I often think of one of our Mexican members who lives in Southern California, who was very quiet for a very long time in our organization. And I wasn't there every week, so I kind of got to know him over a series of visits over many years. And eventually I went to visits, and there was this glorious floral arrangement in the Dignity space, and I was just blown away. And I was told, oh yeah, this man did it, this quiet gentleman. I talked to him, I was like, where did you get this talent, this artistry? And he said that he had always wanted to, he always thought that his gift of arranging flowers and seeing the beauty in flowers was something he could offer to the church, but his parish refused him the ability to do it because he was a gay man in a same-sex relationship. And when he got to Dignity, it took him many years before he would offer that service because he had been burned so badly by the rejection. But here he has had this, I think it was for Dias de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, absolutely gorgeous altar. And he does all of their flowers for every major feast. And then when we had our conference in San Diego in 2022, he did the floral arrangements for the entire conference so he could share his gift with the entire national community that gathered. And, just to help him open up and see what artistry he had and how well received his gift was in a different kind of Catholic community was just another example to me of how we can transform lives.
100%. And I have two other questions. My second to last one is, and you've mentioned this really eloquently during our conversation, that many people in the LGBTQ plus community have justifiable fear and hesitancy surrounding religion, especially Catholicism, because of legacies of harm, spiritual and physical violence.
Yep.
How do you, in many ways, navigate what that relationship looks like in secular spaces? I know you mentioned at recent rallies, at protests, providing and standing with the community. How do you explain the importance and existence of your organization to people who are hesitant?
Absolutely. I think that all we can do is acknowledge that way too often religious values are not lived in the way we believe they deserve to be lived, and that faith is used to condemn rather than to uplift and make whole. After we acknowledge that, we say, just coming out is an inherently spiritual process and needs to have a place where you can give that naming and shaping if you feel the call to do that. There are organizations, there are churches, there are temples, there are mosques where you can do that. If it's helpful, we can help you try and find them. Everybody's spiritual journey is personal. And, a lot of people come to Dignity, do the work of kind of getting some level of integration between the parts of themselves that feel divided. And then they take off on a different spiritual path. They may go to another Christian denomination. They may have personal spiritual practices. They may form some kind of alternative community. They may get into meditation. Who knows what it's going to be? But if they have a healthy and safe, supportive community around them and the ability to sustain themselves spiritually, great. It doesn't have to be Catholic. So we'd love it when people stay with us because they can keep the work going for the future. But it's really hard to turn some of that trauma around, but we try and do it for as many people as we can.
100%. And in reflecting on our conversation today, what I really value is that Dignity USA, and I knew, but it hadn't clicked in my brain that Dignity is right alongside MCC as kind of this first LGBTQ plus organization of faith that's really pioneering these spaces of welcome. And just as you say, for people who are hesitant, it's a space, hopefully a safe and secure one for people to land, especially people who have encountered religious trauma, to navigate what it means and what it looks like to heal and to move forward, even if that's not in Catholic spaces. With that being said, looking forward to the future, and the future of leadership in Dignity. I know among many LGBTQ plus Catholic organizations, there's this particular aging within the organization. People are unfortunately passing on or retiring, shifting to new roles in life. What does it look like to advocate and connect with younger generations today?
Yeah, we're really fortunate to have a thriving young adult group. There are some amazing leaders and visionaries in that group, and they are helping us re-envision what dignity is going to look like. I don't know that the model of local communities celebrating Mass on a weekly basis is going to be our long-term future. What it's going to look like, I don't really know. We are seeing a lot more people who come and do that transition thing and then leave, and maybe they'll come back at some point when they have kids. Maybe they'll want, a sacramental community then. We don't know what that future is going to look like. We feel like we are very much in an era of change, and we are just very intentionally listening to that call. Even as we figure out how do we care for our older members. So many of our members are from that generation that separated from their families or who didn't have support of their families, and Dignity became their families. And, we have power of attorney over, our chapter members. medical care, and local communities go in and take care of folks when they're sick, or help them move to an assisted living or a nursing home facility, or make sure that if they have home health care, there are people who are going to be supportive of them and they're not forced back into the closet. So at the same time, we're trying to figure out what are the needs and the structures that will support our younger generations. We're also taking care of the folks in their 80s and 90s and late 70s who rely on us for support. So, for us, it's very much a both and at this moment. And we feel like we did in the AIDS crisis, we're kind of charting a path that is very much unknown and trying to figure out what those models look like. We are working closely with some of the women's religious communities who are facing some of the same challenges to learn from what they did, how they combine some communities, how they change their leadership structures, how they are intentionally planning to become something different, or even to end their work, with documentation, celebration, and care. Some or all of those models may apply to us. We're actively trying to figure all that out. They're really big questions.
They really, really are. And that does, I will add just one caveat question. So one thing that I really love about LGBTQ plus Catholic history, and I know it's continued, as you mentioned, with priests during the AIDS crisis, with priests that initially became involved in Dignity. How have people in professed life been part of Dignity historically? I know there's a rich history of gay and lesbian, bisexual and queer nuns, sisters, men and women religious of all different communities.
Yeah. It's been a journey we've walked with each other. There have always been queer women and men in religious life, as diocesan priests, as order priests, brothers, nuns. Now we're dealing with trans women and trans men coming out in their ministries and in their communities. And it's very exciting, in particular, that women's communities and starting to see some of the men's orders really do good work around gender and sexuality issues within them. We often try and support that from the background, or, they'll bring members of our community in to speak about our experiences, to kind of open pathways for hopefully members of their own community to feel safe enough to tell their stories in time. I think that's important work to be doing. It's happening everywhere. There are now, young women and young men who are openly queer as they enter religious life, and more orders, and no, not so much dioceses, but mostly orders are doing a much better job of affirming those folks on their journeys. And maybe they profess final vows, maybe they have a different relationship with the community at some point in their lives, but at least the questions of gender identity and sexuality are being dealt with in religious communities in particular, often in much healthier and straightforward and honest ways than they ever have before. So I feel like that's a really exciting development.
We're so grateful to Marianne for joining us and for her decades of leadership with Dignity USA. Conversations like this remind us that our history as queer Catholics is still being written by people showing up, organizing, and building community every day.
Yeah, and as we close out LGBTQ plus History Month, we just want to emphasize that the work doesn't end here. Whether it's Dignity, New Ways Ministry, Outreach, or countless parish and grassroots groups, these communities continue to make space where the church has too often shut its doors.
It's slow, it's steady, and it's sacred. The work of insisting on dignity and belonging isn't glamorous, but it's the foundation for everything that comes next. And it's rooted in individual action, There are many everyday saints of queer communities whose names we will never know, but their action is what enables us to exist and fight for our rights today.
Thank you for being part of this conversation, for listening, and for helping us celebrate the beauty and resilience of queer Catholic life.
If you haven't already, you can find our past episodes and essays on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Until next time, thanks for listening, and happy LGBTQ+ History Month.
Goodbye!